Good evening and welcome. My name is Gil Scott-Heron. We'd like to do a poem for you called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, primarily because it won't be.
I know you've been hurt by someone else.
You can't think of the name Gil Scott-Heron without thinking of his title, the Godfather of Rap. A figurehead of black protest culture in the 1970s, he was admired for his unique syncopated spoken word pieces and his incredible and progressive soul anthems. But by 2010, 40 years into his career, he was asking,
But I'm new here. Show me around.
it would turn out to be his final album, as he would die just 1 year later. Although worn and broken from decades of legal and personal troubles, he was ready to strip his previously constructed sound into something minimal, sparse, strong. But first, before we end the story so soon, let's look at his track record. In 1949, Gil Scott-Heron was born in Chicago to Bobby Scott, a teacher of English abroad, and Gilbert Heron, the first black football player for Celtic FC in Scotland.
Did any of the magic rub off in terms of footballing ability? Can you kick a ball around?
I can kick ass if I have to.
I can believe that.
His parents separated at the age of 2, so during the majority of his childhood, Gil lived in Jackson, Tennessee with his grandmother Lily Scott, and it was in her company that he would start to learn the piano and how to write poetry. Lily passed when Gil was 12, which meant he relocated again to the Bronx in New York City, where he spent his high school tenure as one of only 5 black students in his class. Then, when it was time to go to college, Gil attended Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, following in the footsteps of his greatest inspiration, introduced to him by his grandmother, Langston Hughes.
He was a Renaissance man. He wrote songs, he wrote poetry, he wrote columns, he wrote essays. And as a writer myself, I knew that you couldn't use just one form and get every idea across.
At Lincoln, I did meet some incredible people, and one of them was Gil, and I felt like, okay, well, I met my Langston Hughes.
The last poets are going to do a piece for us now, and I can only beg that everyone can accept it in the spirit that it's delivered.
Walking down on 42nd Street, heard some black folks talking, had a riot yesterday, 10 niggas died, nigga, say what? 10 niggas died, yeah, died, nigga.
May 19th, 1968. Malcolm X's birthday, 3 years after his untimely assassination. Garland Kane, Abiodun Oyewole, and David Nelson first performed as the Last Poets in what is now the Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem. Whilst enduring many lineup changes along the way, losing Nelson and Kane and gaining Ammar bin Hassan and Jalal Nuruddin, they later transitioned into recorded albums, their first LP notably featuring only percussion back in their speech.
When the revolution comes, transit cops will be crushed by the trains after losing their guns, and blood will run through the streets of Harlem, drowning anything without substance when the revolution comes. When the revolution comes.
We were trying to figure out what instrumentation goes with us, and the drums seemed the most appropriate, particularly as it connected with Africa. Willie Kokosili's poem spoke of this catharsis of this violence that would take place in the street. The poetry would turn into the actions in the bodies of the people.
At the turn of the 70s, Gil had already published 2 novels as well as a volume of poetry named after the New York intersection where the Lenox Lounge, an iconic venue for jazz artists, resided. Its title was Small Talk at 125th and Lenox. This is Bob Thiele, a powerhouse producer in recorded jazz music, having produced records for bassist Charles Mingus and saxophonist Pharaoh Saunders and John Coltrane, primarily for the record label Impulse, but also his own, Flying Dutchman. Thiele was interested in having a primarily spoken word album in the Dutchman catalogue, and Gil was approached to record his debut release, also titled Small Talk at 125th and Lenox.
America was a bastard, the illegitimate daughter of the mother country, whose legs were then spread around the world, and a rapist known as freedom, free doom.
From here, Gil's recording career, not just as a poet but as an artist, accelerated higher and higher. His debut studio album, entitled Pieces of a Man, came out in late 1971, also produced by Bob Thiele.
A junkie walking through the twilight, I'm on my way home.
A direct antithesis to the sparse conga drums on 125th, Brian Jackson, a musician that Gil met during his time at Lincoln University, co-wrote many of the album's tracks and arranged almost all the instrumentals, immersing Gil's striking lyricism into a smooth jazz-funk backdrop. Pieces of a Man also opens with Gil's most iconic piece, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
The revolution will not go better with coke. The revolution will not fight germs that may cause bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised.
Following the release of Pieces of a Man, Gil insisted that Brian's name be credited alongside his for each album following, and by 1982 he had recorded over a dozen studio albums, some for Clive Davis's newly formed Arista Records. Although having a bright soul sound courtesy of Jackson's writing and Gil's incredible voice, he never lost his focus on the contemporary social issues within his lyrics, like hit single The Bottle, tackling alcoholism.
He done quit his 9 to 5, he drank full time, and now he's living in a bottle.
In 1980, he toured extensively with Stevie Wonder on a campaign to establish Martin Luther King Day, which eventually was passed, and in 1985 he was one of many artists featured on Sun City, a charity single opposing apartheid. But by the next decade, the 1990s, his activity as an artist decreased dramatically, only releasing one album on TVT Records, and having a slight resurgence as the voiceover that says, "You know when you've been tangoed" at the end of the Tango drink adverts where a big orange man just slaps people.
I will slap your face so super hard.
And as the 2000s rolled around, Gil's health declined and he slowly became more and more reliant on drug use. In July 2001, he intended to enroll in a residential drug rehab program after being charged with possession of cocaine, but by October the same year, he failed to do so and so was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. Reports stated that Gil had lost many of his teeth and his speech was slurred at the court hearing. He would also struggle with addiction further, with more criminal charges for possession of a crack pipe in 2003 and for violating a plea deal in 2006, all while suffering with HIV. However, as the 2000s ended, Gil slowly recovered both his physical health and his career, returning to performing and touring around the US and Europe in 2009.
Did that period affect your music, do you think, the way you saw life?
No, I'm saying I still had some of the same songs that people wanted. People didn't ask me, well, why don't you play us something from your period when you were in jail? Well, I didn't have a piano.
During this period of inactivity, Gil managed to make a living from royalties generated from his work, most notably from producer Kanye West sampling elements of his tracks across the mid-2000s.
They say home is where the hate is, my dome is where fate is. I stroll where souls get lost like Vegas.
Kanye's repeated recognition of Gil was just one of many tributes to his legacy as an artist, like he was gone. However, despite his frailty and shadowy persona, he was just about ready to reappear. But if he needed Brian Jackson 40 years ago, he needed another creative partner, someone new.
Your name's not down, you're not coming in.
Having been inspired by his records across his childhood, electronic producer Richard Russell sent letters to Gil conversing back and forth whilst he was serving his second prison term. He also runs the label XL Recordings, which by 2010 had many notable signees, originating with dance acts like The Prodigy, and most recently up until that point publishing music from Adele, Vampire Weekend, Basement Jaxx, MIA and the XX, the latter important to the story of I'm New Here. Within these letters, Richard offered to record with Gil at the label's studio in London, and as one of the biggest independent labels worldwide, XL would publish whatever came out of the sessions. Gil agreed, and slowly by 2007, he was finally recording again. There is a proper procedure for taking advantage of any investment. Music, for example. Buying a CD is an investment. To get the maximum, you must listen to it for the first time under optimum conditions. Not in your car or on a portable player through a headset. Take it home. Get rid of all distractions, even her or him. Turn off your cell phone, turn off everything that rings or beeps or rattles or whistles. Make yourself comfortable. Play your CD. Listen all the way through. Think about what you got. Think about who would appreciate this investment. Decide if there is someone to share this with. Turn it on again. Enjoy yourself. If you have any knowledge on hip-hop, these strings should be instantly recognisable. On loop, these are the opening moments of Kanye West's Flashing Lights, albeit with a low-pass filter, muffled, whilst Gil starts reciting a poem.
And I was full grown before I knew I came from a broken home.
The poem describes Lily Scott, Gil's grandmother, the main adult figure in his life, a guiding light into compassion and the gateway into recognising his own talent.
She had more than the 5 senses. She knew more than books could teach, and raised everyone she touched just a little bit higher.
I interpret the use of flashing lights on Gil's comeback album as a sort of thank you to Kanye for maintaining his musical profile during his period of inactivity.
And I was hurt and scared and shocked when Lily Scott left suddenly one night, and I came from a broken home.
Me and the Devil directly introduces Rich's industrial production style for this record, containing a defining synth line, buzzing bass, and a rhythmic, steady trip-hop beat. The song itself was written in 1937 by landmark blues musician Robert Johnson, and it's a powerful song describing selling your soul to the devil to play music, also poignant as Johnson himself would die just over a year after the original song was recorded.
And I say, hello, Satan, I believe it's time to go.
In stark comparison to his early work, Gil's voice is rough and ragged, yelping and hollering the lyrics with a sense of desperation and catharsis.
Me and the devil walking side by side.
Whereas the original song links the imagery of the devil to the blues, those lines can be recontextualized when knowing more context about Gil himself. The metaphor and symbolism of the devil instead being attributed to drugs and crack, an addiction that haunted him up until his passing. It did walk side by side with him and led him down a painful path across the latter half of his life.
You may bury my body down by the highway side.
Gil's wailing floats on top of the steady moving synthetic drums, with backing keys rising as played by Damon Albarn of Blur and Gorillaz. It's a confession to a life of sin, his age and weakness showing as he accepts death, and it's only the start of the album.
I played on a cover of a Bill Callahan slash Smog song called I'm New Here. Richard's idea was to just have it pretty spared down.
A direct contrast to the track before, the electronic beats that drove the last track are dropped in favour of a single, lonely acoustic guitar line.
I did not become someone different that I did not want to be.
Despite being a cover, someone else's words, they can still apply to Gil's life. Although wounded from his years of troubles, his personality remained continuously the same. When everything withered and subsequently regrew, his charm was the driving force that kept him alive. Above all, he is still Gil Scott-Heron.
No matter how far wrong you've gone, you can always turn around.
Not much analysis is needed. Gil was just stating his new philosophy, how he wants to move going forward, how he wants his head and heart to work with each other. But because deep down he is still himself, his ego remains, stating self-centered lines like,
but I'm the closest thing I have to voice reason.
I don't believe it's a sense of moral superiority, but it's an ideology that lets his own gut feeling drive what he wants to do. He might be reinvigorated, but it doesn't change his basic principles, as proven by the sentiment,
turn around, turn around, turn around. You may come full circle.
The next track, Your Soul and Mine, is another cover, but this time it's something from Gil's own catalogue, The Vulture, a poem from his very first release, Small Talk. By comparison, bar the words themselves, they sound nothing alike. The original sounds like this.
I am death, cried the vulture.
Congas, hand claps, piano, and Gil's young voice. By comparison,
standing in the ruins of another black man's life, or flying through the valley, separating day and night.
A loop of a cello, dubstep drums, and a beating bass line. Richard's production feels so much more claustrophobic and raw. Gil performs in something called a blank verse, meaning he doesn't follow a set rhythm and basically just ignores the drums by just simply speaking.
He knew the ghetto was a haven for the meanest creature ever known.
The symbolism of the vulture itself represents the cruelty of drug abuse, violence and poverty on black communities in the time which the poem was written. Gil covering this song 40 years on just reinforces the prevalence of these issues within the community and how it just never goes away, lingering within the disadvantaged. It actually lingers within Gil himself. A few months after I'm New Here was released, Gil took part in a profile for The New Yorker with Alec Wilkinson writing, "When I first began visiting Scott-Heron, he would leave the room at intervals and go into his bathroom. The next time I went to his apartment, he went into his kitchen and a stream of smoke drifted out. One day I turned around and he had his crack pipe to his lips, and after that he didn't bother to leave the room anymore. Sometimes he would fall asleep in the middle of an interview, and I would excuse myself."
So if you see the vulture coming,
flying circles in your mind. Remember, there is no escaping, for he will follow close behind.
Very short spoken word interludes appear frequently across the album, taking forms of quips of Gil taken seemingly mid-conversation, like he isn't aware the mic's on and he's just speaking his wisdom to whoever wants to hear.
I believe that the spirits are your parents, they are in your bloodstream, because they want you to live on. And if you just spend a few minutes with yourself, you will hear them, you will hear them.
The next track is yet another cover, this one the Brooke Benton penned I'll Take Care of You, a classic in the blues genre, made famous by Bobby Bland's original rendition from 1959.
I know you've been hurt by someone else.
I can tell by the way you carry yourself.
Lyrically, the song isn't about stealing or claiming a lover who's just been heartbroken. It's about offering solace and empathy to someone who has gone through it. Gil doesn't edit this meaning, he just reiterates it, albeit with added pain. You can hear it when he bellows,
I've loved and I've lost the same as you.
It's odd for someone of his age, 60, to try and croon about emerging love, especially with his strained and frail voice, but to cover a song like I'll Take Care of You shows the sentimentality around simply putting others before you.
You won't ever have to worry.
And with that, the song moves extremely slowly, guided by only just a looping kick drum. Gil, as he plays the piano, takes his time with his words and he pours all emotion he has left into them.
For I'll be there beside you to dry your weeping eyes.
Long ago the clock washed midnight away, bringing the dawn.
The second original poem on the album, Where Did the Night Go?, is a confessional view into a sort of nighttime routine, reflecting the monotony, the hopelessness of it, only accompanied by processed and artificially slowed down drums. It's absolutely nowhere near the safety of a backing band and warm piano lines. It's haunting.
Should have been asleep when I was sitting there drinking beer and trying to start another letter to you.
Gil's voice commands attention whether he's performing or not, but here he sounds noticeably different. He sounds ashamed to even be saying this. A theme that runs through I'm New Here is the recognition of problems and the beginning of change, but this is the point where he's taking a form of accountability.
So I wouldn't be up by myself. Where did the night go?
That eponymous question could be a view on mortality, maybe even a depiction of loneliness, both important themes of the album. Both themes are gone more into depth, as he states, for the record.
Yeah, the doctor don't know, but New York was killing me.
With its minimalistic handclaps and stabs of distorted 808 bass, in the centerpiece of the record, Gil openly describes his struggle and acceptance of fate due to his life in the fast lane, which he just can't handle anymore. The personifying phrase, killing me, is meant to be taken literally. It could be something more prevalent in urban areas like pollution, but it could also be the supply and demand of hard drugs, something Gil was, as we've established, addicted to. He was genuinely dying.
Yeah, well, I need to go home and take it slow down in Jackson, Tennessee.
His still powerful baritone voice harks back to where he spent his childhood with his grandmother, the location where he learnt his destiny. He wants everything to end where it started. It's an accepting attitude to a demise he seems to foresee. Something I'll dig into later is the fact that I'm New Here has been remixed a number of times since its release, and this is just one of those diamonds. Director Chris Cunningham, best known for his music videos for Aphex Twin, Björk, Portishead and films like Rubber Johnny, all containing distinct futuristic visuals, created this for the Museum of Modern Art, projected onto 3 screens. All of the percussion is completely removed in favour of train sounds and field recordings. It hollows out the music and makes lines like,
Yeah, they got 8 million people and I didn't have a single friend.
even more striking and heartbreaking. It's so much more darker figuratively and literally. Back on the original song, Cunningham also contributes additional guitar and a creepy artificial choir synth as backing vocals beg.
Lord have mercy, mercy on me.
It's one of the most poignant songs of the album when you consider it as his last. And when Gil died the following year in 2011, he died not in Jackson, but in New York.
Certain bad things that happen make you realize that you've been here a lot longer than a whole bunch of people thought you would. Because I always feel like running, not away, because there's no such place.
Richard has a focus on drums in his production style for this album, patterns that loop and stagnate as Gil tries to regain his comfort both in life and in performing. The key message of the track Running is Gil's proposed fearlessness, his desire to take danger head on instead of hiding away and waiting for trouble to be over.
As in having given someone a run for his money, or as in running out of time.
He doesn't want to be misinterpreted. He doesn't want to be remembered as something he was not, a quitter. During his lifetime, he shunned the godfather of rap title he was and has been associated with. He didn't want to consider himself as a superior, just someone who had the confidence to, in his own words, run in.
Not running for my life, because I have to be running for something of more value.
Richard's electronics are a subtle yet major part of what gives these songs their identity, and Gil would later attribute much of I'm New Here to Richard, going as far to state it might as well have been his album, as he took much more of a backseat role compared to anything he had worked on musically in his lifetime. The sound was influenced by the subdued and lightly layered production of the XX's debut album, released only a year prior.
His spirit and his outlook struck me as very intact, despite the circumstances.
And so my life has been guided, and all the love I needed was provided.
The flashing lights sample re-emerges from silence as the second part of On Coming From a Broken Home concludes the album at only a brief 28 minutes. Richard Russell said about Gil, "He's genuinely philosophical. He's not hung up on time or ordinary circumstances, and I've never come across anyone as interesting to talk to." To sign off the record, he pays tribute to not just his grandmother, but all women involved in his upbringing. He realised that their sacrifices are all done with the deepest love, taking the place of a physical presence. He says,
"Maybe there are homes that are hurt, but there are no real lives that hurt will not reach, but not broken."
He acknowledges the cliche of a strong mother and an absent father, but he combats it by recognising that they all still had purpose no matter what they served as. If they died, they, quote, lost their lives, but not what their lives stood for, unquote. Gil's father passed in 2008, a year prior to recording sessions for I'm New Here starting.
I came from what they called a broken home, but if they ever really called at our house.
The following lines are the final of the album, his last words as a recording artist. They end the closing chapter of his story and summarise Gil not just as a person, but as human.
My life has been guided by women, but because of them, I am a man. God bless you, Mama. And thank you.
These lines are incredibly moving, a beautifully written farewell dedicated to the guiding light for anybody, a mother. He courageously admits that he couldn't have grown and been New Here on his own. He needed to re-ground himself as his mother's protege. He came from a broken home, and he lived a repaired life. Gil died on May the 27th, 2011 from complications from an undisclosed illness. I'm New Here was his final studio album, and he left behind a legacy of powerful music and poetry that moved a broad range of generations, even to this day. But every good book has an epilogue, and I'm New Here is no exception. In 2014, a posthumous album titled Nothing New was released. Back in 2005, when Richard first approached Gil to record an album, he initially suggested recording sparse and stripped down arrangements of songs from his prior catalogue, which would eventually create a, quote, intriguing album. Just his voice and piano.
Hiding in the shadows, so scared that you want to scream, but you dare not make a sound if you want to hold on to your dream.
Gradually, the sessions evolved into what would become I'm New Here, but following Gil's passing, Richard revisited the sessions and discovered they had, in fact, made the album they set out to create, alongside I'm New Here.
Signed to XL's sister label, Young, indie pop band The XX, and specifically its lead producer Jamie Smith, were experiencing a high level of success coming into the 2010s. Their minimal and bass-focused beats were a key influence on Richard's production style for the album, and he approached Jamie with the stems from the I'm New Here sessions and offered him, also a long-time fan of Gil, the chance to remix the material into something new. No pun intended. Richard wanted to have just one producer rework the whole record to retain its cohesiveness rather than multiple people pick it apart track by track. In February 2011, We're New Here was released.
You can always turn around.
We're New Here does not use any of the music from the original album, just the vocals, which makes the comparison between the two much more stark. It even uses additional samples unrelated to Gil to build a whole different narrative. They sound nothing alike. An experimental blues spoken word piece compared to a post-dubstep and future garage influenced dance track. Those might sound like buzzwords, but it basically means that the overall sound is much more airy and brighter than the original, diminishing the meaning of the songs lyrically but emphasizing their atmosphere.
I've loved and I've loved.
In a similar way to Richard, Jamie wrote physical letters to Gil for his approval regarding tracks on the album, asking for permission to include other unused material like an acoustic rendition of Home Is Where the Hatred Is. After I wrote him the letter, he said I was free to do whatever because he knew what I was doing. I'm New Here was Gil Scott-Heron's final album, but it was so much more than that. It was a form of rumination, a view on what it means to keep living when all elements are telling you otherwise. His choice to cover songs from a bygone period, like Me and the Devil, sheds away the legend status he has grown and uncovers the human underneath. Someone who just wants to love. Someone who feels inside like he is going to die. It was a mission statement to simply try. Nothing more, nothing less. He didn't want to be superior, and he didn't want to be seen as that either. He wasn't the godfather of rap. He was Gil Scott-Heron.
You're credited with that kind of thing. It means you're looking ahead, not behind you. And that's what most people are. They're behind me. They came behind me, and if they're following me, good. I can't turn around and see how many people are following in my footsteps or just following me with a stick in their heads.